The Porsche's engine went silent the instant Ethan Brooks lifted the hood. What had he just seen? Laughter rolled across the luxury showroom before fading into an uneasy hush beneath rows of brilliant white LED lights. The polished concrete floor reflected the midnight blue Porsche like a mirror, while the sharp scent of premium leather mixed with warm engine oil drifting from the open compartment. Victoria Sterling stood beside the car with effortless confidence, one hand resting on the glossy rear fender, the diamond on her watch scattering tiny flashes of light every time she moved. A few seconds earlier she had smiled at the crowd, lifted an eyebrow toward the quiet mechanic in the worn canvas jacket, and joked loudly enough for every investor, executive, and journalist to hear. "Fix my Porsche and I'll marry you." The room had erupted with laughter. Someone raised a phone to record. Another executive leaned toward his colleague with an amused grin. Ethan had said nothing. He had simply walked forward carrying an old metal toolbox scarred by years of honest work, placed it gently beside the sports car, and rested one weathered hand on the engine cover. His faded jeans still carried traces of dust from the small neighborhood garage where he spent most of his days repairing pickup trucks, family sedans, and aging work vans just to provide for his 8-year-old daughter. Expensive cars rarely entered his shop. Expensive people almost never did. Yet none of that seemed to matter as he released the rear latch with calm, practiced fingers. The engine cover rose slowly. Warm air escaped first, carrying the smell of heated aluminum and gasoline. Ethan leaned forward. His eyes moved across the engine bay once. Then they stopped. Completely. The easy rhythm of the showroom disappeared. Even the soft background music seemed strangely distant behind the faint metallic ticking of the cooling engine. Victoria noticed the change immediately. His shoulders had not tensed. He had not frowned. He had simply become perfectly still, as though every sound around him had vanished. "Well?" she asked, folding her arms with playful confidence. "Is my Porsche too much for a neighborhood mechanic?" Ethan did not answer. Instead, he lowered himself slightly, studying the engine from another angle without touching a single component. A bright reflection from the overhead lights glided across polished carbon fiber, while the chrome intake shimmered beneath the open hood. He reached into his toolbox, not for an expensive diagnostic computer, but for a small inspection mirror with a scratched metal handle. Several engineers exchanged amused looks. One quietly whispered, "He actually thinks he'll find something with that?" Ethan slid the mirror carefully beneath a bundle of wiring, his movements slow enough to suggest he was listening as much as looking. Victoria stepped closer. The click of her heels echoed across the floor until she stood only a few feet away. "You know," she said with another confident smile, "you can admit defeat now. Nobody will remember." Ethan finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, almost gentle. "Who worked on this engine last?" Her smile paused. "3 certified Porsche specialists." He kept looking beneath the hood. "And nobody questioned the repair?" "Why would they?" Victoria replied. Ethan slowly straightened, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. The laughter had disappeared from every corner of the showroom before he quietly said, "Because if I'm right, this Porsche should never have been started today. SUA Victoria's smile lingered for only a heartbeat before she noticed something had changed around her. The easy laughter filling the showroom faded beneath the low hum of the ceiling lights and the faint clicking of the Porsche's cooling engine. Ethan Brooks had not moved away from the open hood. He had not reached for another tool. He simply remained where he was, the scratched inspection mirror still resting in his hand, as though one careless movement might disturb something that deserved absolute patience. "Answer me," Victoria said, her voice lighter than before but no longer playful. "Why shouldn't it have been started?" Ethan slipped the mirror back into his toolbox with deliberate care. The worn metal clasps clicked shut against the polished floor's silence. "Because whoever worked on this engine fixed the symptom," he replied, "not the cause." A few engineers exchanged skeptical glances. One of them stepped forward, adjusting the company badge clipped neatly to his pressed shirt. "We've serviced this vehicle 3 times using factory procedures," he said. Every diagnostic report came back clean. Ethan looked at him for barely a second. "Computers report what sensors notice. Mechanics notice what computers can't." Victoria folded her arms again, though this time her fingers tightened against the sleeve of her tailored jacket. "You're making a serious claim." I'm making an observation. She took another step toward the open engine bay. Warm air still drifted upward, carrying the scent of hot aluminum, fresh rubber, and premium fuel. Bright white light reflected across the carbon fiber engine cover, while chrome fittings shimmered beneath the LEDs. "Show me," she said. Ethan reached into the compartment, not to remove anything, but to gently rest 2 fingertips against a mounting bracket hidden beneath a bundle of wiring. He left them there for several seconds before withdrawing his hand. "Feel this." Victoria hesitated only briefly before leaning over the Porsche. The metal felt warmer than the surrounding components. She frowned. "It's still holding heat." Ethan nodded once. "Exactly." One engineer quickly placed his own hand nearby, then looked at another technician without speaking. The expression on his face shifted almost imperceptibly. Ethan closed the engine cover halfway, instead of slamming it shut. "I need the car moved." Victoria blinked. "Where?" "Out of the showroom." "Why?" "Because I won't inspect it surrounded by cameras." The reporters waiting nearby immediately raised their lenses higher. Victoria looked toward them, then back at Ethan. "This launch has taken months to organize. Then don't waste it by pretending everything's fine." His voice never rose above conversation level, yet every word seemed to travel farther than the laughter had only minutes earlier. Victoria studied him carefully. There was no arrogance in his face, no attempt to embarrass her, no satisfaction in challenging a CEO before her guests. Only quiet. Certainty. She turned toward the showroom staff. "Clear the service bay." The room froze. Her chief engineer stared in disbelief. "Ms. Sterling, the presentation starts in 15 minutes. She kept her eyes on Ethan. "Not anymore." She walked to the driver's door herself, slipped into the seat, and pressed the start button. Ethan's hand came up immediately. "Don't." She stopped with her finger hovering over the switch. The cabin remained silent except for the soft chime from the dashboard and the whisper of the climate control fan. Ethan opened the driver's door before she could react, removed the key fob from the center console, and closed the door again. Then he placed the key in his own pocket, looked directly into Victoria's eyes, and said quietly, "If you still want your Porsche fixed, from this moment forward, nobody starts this engine except me." SUA, the Porsche rolled slowly into the glass-walled service bay, its tires whispering across the polished epoxy floor while the bright showroom lights gave way to the cool white glow of overhead work lamps. Ethan walked beside the car with the key fob still in his pocket, guiding Victoria with a slight motion of his hand instead of words. She followed without protest. Behind the glass partition, reporters and executives gathered in uneasy clusters, their muffled conversations blending with the distant hiss of an air compressor and the rhythmic clicking of cooling metal. The smell changed here. The expensive perfume and polished leather of the showroom faded into warm engine oil, clean steel, and fresh rubber. Ethan rested his dented toolbox on a stainless steel workbench, opened it carefully, and laid out only a flashlight, an inspection mirror, a small torque wrench, and 2 plastic trim tools. One engineer couldn't hide a faint smile. "No skin tool?" he asked. Ethan looked at the Porsche instead of the man. "Not yet." Victoria stepped closer, folding her jacket neatly over a nearby chair instead of handing it to an assistant. "You really believe those tools can tell you more than factory diagnostics?" Ethan switched on the flashlight. Its narrow white beam traced across the engine compartment without touching a single wire. "Machines answer questions," he said. "The problem is knowing which question to ask." The chief engineer crossed his arms. "We've already asked all of them." Ethan slid the inspection mirror beneath the intake assembly, adjusted the angle by only a fraction of an inch, then slowly lowered the light until its reflection illuminated the hidden mounting points. He remained silent long enough that everyone else stopped speaking too. The only sound came from the low buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. He withdrew the mirror and handed it to Victoria. "Hold it exactly there." She hesitated before taking it. The cool metal handle pressed into her palm. Ethan adjusted the flashlight until the reflected light struck the backside of an aluminum bracket. "What do you notice?" Victoria leaned closer. At first she saw nothing except polished metal. Then the reflection shifted. Fine crescent-shaped marks surrounded one bolt head, fresh enough to shine beneath the light. Ethan picked up a sealed replacement bracket from a Porsche parts box sitting on a nearby shelf and placed it beside the installed one without saying a word. The untouched factory finish was flawless. The bracket inside her car wasn't. One engineer stepped forward instinctively. Those marks weren't there from the factory. Ethan gave a single nod. Someone removed this assembly. The engineer frowned. That doesn't prove anything. Ethan set the replacement bracket back onto the shelf. No, he agreed quietly. It proves someone ignored procedure. Victoria's eyes remained fixed on the engine. She had trusted reports, certifications, and expensive equipment because that was how her world operated. Yet the first person to challenge all of it had arrived carrying an old toolbox and fewer than a dozen hand tools. She looked toward her engineering team. No one offered an explanation. Ethan closed the engine cover gently, but left it unlatched. "I'm finished for now," he said, wiping his hands with a clean shop towel. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "Finished, until I know who authorized the last repair." She drew a slow breath, the cool air from the service bay brushing against, the warmth still rising from the Porsche. Then she turned away from Ethan and faced her entire engineering department. "Nobody leaves this building," she said. "Not until someone tells me why this car was opened without following factory procedure." No one answered Victoria's question. The silence in the service bay settled heavier than the scent of warm aluminum and fresh rubber drifting from the Porsche's open engine compartment. The white fluorescent lights reflected sharply across the polished paint, while the low hum of the ventilation system became the only sound anyone dared notice. Ethan Brooks remained beside the car with both hands resting lightly on the edge of his worn toolbox. He neither defended himself nor pressed anyone for an explanation. He simply waited. Victoria slowly looked from one engineer to the next. Every face that had carried confidence in the showroom now searched the floor, a clipboard, or the stainless steel workbench instead of meeting her eyes. She reached toward the service counter, picked up a stack of repair folders, and placed them one by one onto the metal table. Paper slid across steel with a dry whisper. "Bring me every invoice, every inspection report, every warranty document connected to this Porsche," she said. "Now." A young technician hurried away. Another disappeared into the records office. Ethan watched without interfering. A few minutes later, thick folders covered the workbench. Victoria opened the first one herself. The crisp pages smelled faintly of fresh toner and filing cabinets. Oil changes, tire rotations, software updates, routine inspections. She turned another page, then another. Ethan remained motionless until she stopped. "Something missing?" he asked quietly. Victoria frowned. The maintenance dates flowed cleanly across the first half of the file, then skipped forward nearly 6 weeks before continuing as though nothing had happened. She checked again. The page numbers matched, yet the gap remained. She opened the second folder. The same gap. A third. Again. Her fingers slowed. She looked toward the chief engineer. "Why are these records incomplete?" He swallowed before answering. I don't know." Ethan finally stepped closer to the table. Instead of touching the paperwork, he gently closed the nearest folder. "You don't need those pages to fix the car." Victoria looked at him. "Then why ask for them?" "Because I needed to know whether you'd ask the question." She held his gaze for several long seconds. Outside the glass wall, investors waited beside untouched champagne glasses while photographers lowered their cameras in confusion. The product launch had already dissolved into uncertainty. She could still end all of this. She could thank Ethan for his opinion, hand the Porsche back to her engineering department, and continue the presentation as planned. Her reputation would survive. Her schedule would recover. Everything would return to normal. Instead, she reached for the event microphone lying on a nearby podium. The polished metal felt cool against her fingers. She pressed the power button. A soft tone echoed through the showroom speakers. Every conversation beyond the glass stopped instantly. Victoria stepped into view where investors, reporters, and employees could all see her. Bright showroom lights reflected from the Porsche behind her. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said calmly, "today's launch is postponed." A ripple of surprise spread across the room. She continued before anyone could interrupt. "The integrity of this vehicle matters more than this event. From this moment forward, Mr. Ethan Brooks has full authority over its inspection and repair. Every member of my engineering team will cooperate completely." She lowered the microphone and returned it to the stand. No applause followed. No objections came either. Ethan looked at her for a brief moment, then walked back toward the Porsche, picked up a clean pair of nitrile gloves from his toolbox, and quietly said, "Then let's fix it the right way." Siwa Ethan slipped on the nitrile gloves with a quiet snap, then rolled a bright portable work light behind the Porsche until its white beam flooded the engine compartment from edge to edge. Every polished aluminum surface reflected cleanly beneath the light, while the faint smell of fresh sealant mixed with warm engine oil lingering in the cool service bay. Victoria stood only a few feet away now, no longer separated from him by executives or cameras. She removed her blazer completely, folded it across a nearby chair, and stayed beside the workbench instead of returning to the showroom. Ethan opened 3 unopened Porsche parts boxes, laying every factory component onto a blue fender cover in perfectly straight rows. He never rushed. Every bolt rested in its own tray. Every clip faced the same direction. Even the engineers who had questioned him earlier watched without speaking. The only sounds came from the soft click of a ratchet, the distant hiss of compressed air, and the occasional metallic tick from the cooling exhaust. Ethan loosened the damaged assembly one fastener at a time, pausing after each turn to feel the resistance through his fingertips. He removed a mounting bracket, compared it with the untouched replacement under the bright work light, then quietly set the worn piece aside. Victoria leaned closer. "That's all?" she asked. Ethan nodded toward the replacement part. "Precision isn't complicated. It's disciplined." He cleaned the mounting surface with a lint-free cloth until the aluminum reflected like glass. Then he installed the new bracket, tightened each bolt gradually in a crossing pattern, and finished with a small torque wrench that clicked exactly once on every fastener. No extra force. No wasted movement. One of the senior engineers instinctively stepped forward with a factory diagnostic tablet. Ethan raised one hand politely without looking away from the engine. "Wait." The engineer stopped. Ethan reconnected the final harness clip with a gentle push until a crisp mechanical click echoed through the bay. He lowered the engine cover but did not latch it immediately. Instead, he walked once around the Porsche, crouched briefly beside the rear wheel, then returned to the driver's door. Victoria watched every step. "You're still checking it?" she asked. "I'm checking myself." He settled into the driver's seat, adjusted it slightly backward, rested both hands on the steering wheel, and closed his eyes for a single breath. The leather carried the faint scent of cedar, conditioner, and fresh stitching. He pressed the ignition button. The flat six came alive instantly with a smooth, balanced growl that settled into an effortless idle. No hesitation. No uneven vibration. The polished wrench lying on the rear deck remained perfectly still. Ethan lightly touched the accelerator. The engine climbed cleanly through the rev range before returning to idle with quiet confidence. He switched it off immediately. Silence filled the room once more. This time it was different. One engineer connected the factory diagnostic scanner. Green indicators appeared across the screen one after another. Another repeated the test using a second scanner. The result remained identical. No faults. No warnings. No hidden errors. Victoria slowly released the breath she had been holding and rested one hand on the roof of the Porsche. Her fingers traced the flawless paint before she turned toward Ethan. The teasing confidence that had filled the showroom earlier had disappeared completely. She looked at the repaired car, then back at the quiet mechanic standing beside his old toolbox. "I thought I was giving a neighborhood mechanic a chance to impress me," she said softly. Instead, she stopped herself, lowered her eyes for the first time that day, and finished in an almost embarrassed whisper. "I was the one being tested." SUA. The service bay remained quiet long after the engine had stopped, broken only by the soft ticking of cooling exhaust pipes and the gentle whir of the ventilation fans above. Bright white light reflected from the Porsche's flawless paint onto the polished concrete floor, while the clean scent of fresh sealant lingered in the air. Ethan removed his nitrile gloves one finger at a time, folded them neatly, and placed them inside his old toolbox before closing the lid with a familiar metallic click. He acted as though the repair had been nothing extraordinary. Victoria couldn't look away. She had watched world-class engineers present billion-dollar projects with less confidence than the quiet mechanic who had never once raised his voice. Before she could speak again, one of the oldest members of Sterling Automotive's board entered the service bay carrying a weathered leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm. He stopped the moment he saw Ethan standing beside the Porsche. His eyes narrowed with recognition. It can't be, he murmured. The room turned toward him. He walked closer, opened the portfolio carefully, and removed an automotive engineering journal preserved inside a transparent sleeve. The glossy cover had faded with age, but the photograph remained unmistakable. A younger Ethan, clean-shaven and wearing a simple engineering jacket, stood beside a silver performance prototype with one hand resting on its rear fender. Above him, bold headlines praised the lead engineer whose revolutionary drivetrain design had changed the benchmark for modern sports cars. The board member placed the journal gently onto the stainless steel workbench. No one reached for it. Victoria looked from the cover to the man standing only a few feet away in faded jeans and a grease-marked canvas jacket. The two images felt impossible to reconcile. "That's you," she said quietly. Ethan glanced at the magazine for barely a second before closing the cover with calm fingers. It was another chapter. The board member shook his head. "Another chapter? Half the engineers in this industry studied your work. Your torque management system became the standard for high-performance road cars." Ethan rested one hand on his toolbox. Cars move forward. So should people. Victoria searched his face, hoping for pride, satisfaction, or even resentment. She found none. "Why did you leave?" she asked. Ethan looked toward the Porsche instead of the people surrounding him. The bright reflections on its bodywork shimmered softly beneath the service lights. "Because there came a day when someone at home needed me more than another prototype did." He picked up a clean microfiber cloth and slowly wiped a faint fingerprint from the rear glass before folding the cloth into a perfect square. There was no bitterness in the movement, only habit. Victoria noticed the simple gold band no longer resting on his left hand, the careful way he packed each tool before closing the toolbox, and the photograph of a smiling little girl tucked inside the lid that appeared only for a heartbeat before disappearing again. She understood without another word being spoken. Ethan lifted the toolbox. "The Porsche is ready." Victoria reached for the company checkbook lying on the workbench and quickly wrote an amount large enough to surprise even the board members. She tore out the check and held it toward him with both hands. Ethan accepted it politely, looked at the number for a moment, then folded it once and returned it to her. "Spend it on apprentices," he said. "Teach them that patience belongs in every toolbox." He turned toward the service bay door. Behind him, no one laughed anymore. No one whispered. The people who had watched a neighborhood mechanic walk into the showroom now stepped aside without being asked, silently clearing a path for him to leave. Ethan stopped at the service bay door when he heard Victoria's footsteps behind him. The sound of her heels against the polished concrete echoed through the nearly empty workshop before fading into the quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Warm air carrying the scent of engine oil drifted through the open garage while the midnight blue Porsche rested behind them, its paint glowing beneath the white lamps like calm water after a storm. Victoria closed the distance between them, still holding the company check Ethan had refused. Without speaking, she tore it neatly in half. Then again, the pieces slipped quietly into a nearby recycling bin. Ethan watched the paper fall, but said nothing. "Money isn't what I owe you anymore," she said. Her voice carried none of the playful confidence that had filled the showroom only hours earlier. It was steady, careful, almost unfamiliar. Ethan shifted the weight of his dented toolbox into his other hand. "Then you don't owe me anything." She shook her head. "That's not true." She looked toward the Porsche through the glass wall. Reflections from the service lights shimmered across its flawless body while engineers quietly packed away and used diagnostic equipment. No one was speaking now. The same people who had smiled when she joked about marriage had become witnesses to something entirely different. Victoria turned back toward Ethan. "This morning I looked at your jacket before I looked at your eyes." She paused. "I looked at your toolbox before I looked at your hands." Ethan remained still. "And I decided who you were before you ever touched my car." The words settled softly between them. He lowered his toolbox onto the floor with a muted metallic thud. "Most people do." She searched his face, waiting for anger that never arrived. Instead, she found only the same quiet composure that had unsettled everyone from the moment he opened the hood. "Why didn't you put me in my place?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the Porsche again. "Because engines don't care about pride." A faint smile touched one corner of Victoria's mouth before fading again. "Neither do good people, apparently." She reached into her purse and removed a simple white business card with nothing printed except her direct phone number. No corporate logo. No title. She placed it carefully on top of Ethan's toolbox. This isn't a job offer. Ethan looked at the card but did not pick it up. Then what is it? Permission to call me Victoria instead of Ms. Sterling. He finally smiled, small and genuine. That's a promotion. She laughed quietly, the sound almost surprising her. Beyond the open garage door, the evening sun had begun turning the western sky amber, washing warm light across the parking lot and reflecting softly from Ethan's aging pickup truck parked beside the gleaming Porsche. The contrast between the two vehicles seemed smaller now than it had that morning. Victoria folded her arms loosely, no longer as a barrier, but simply because the evening breeze had grown cooler. I made a joke in front of everyone today, she said. You answered it with dignity. Ethan picked up the white card and slipped it into the front pocket of his canvas jacket. Sometimes that's the only answer worth giving. He lifted his toolbox once more and walked toward his pickup. Victoria remained where she stood, watching him unlock the driver's door with the same worn key he had probably carried for years. Just before climbing inside, Ethan looked back over his shoulder. I need to get home, he said. My daughter is waiting. For dinner. For the first time all day, Victoria realized she didn't want the conversation to end, and she took one step forward before quietly calling after him. Then may I bring dessert? So the old pickup eased out of the Sterling Automotive parking lot just as the last rays of sunlight turned the glass facade into a sheet of gold. Ethan drove with one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while the folded white card Victoria had given him remained tucked inside the front pocket of his canvas jacket. The cab smelled faintly of worn leather, machine oil, and the coffee he had forgotten to finish that morning. A few miles later, he turned into the gravel driveway of Brooks Auto Repair, where the familiar squeak of the garage door rolled open before he even shut off the engine. Lily ran across the concrete in oversized sneakers, her ponytail bouncing as she wrapped both arms around him. Ethan laughed softly, setting his heavy toolbox on the floor before lifting her into a quick hug. The warm scent of tomato soup drifted from a slow cooker on the workbench beside an unfinished pickup truck. A small radio played old country music somewhere in the corner, almost hidden beneath the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside. 20 minutes later, another engine entered the quiet evening. This one was unmistakable. Smooth. Refined. Confident. The midnight blue Porsche rolled slowly into the gravel lot and stopped beside Ethan's aging pickup. Victoria stepped out alone. No security, no assistants, no photographers. The tailored business suit had been replaced by dark jeans, a cream sweater, and a light jacket that moved gently in the evening breeze. In one hand, she carried a simple white bakery box tied with red string. In the other, nothing. Ethan looked up from tightening a hose clamp beneath the hood of an old pickup. He wiped his hands with a clean shop towel, but made no move toward the Porsche. Lily peeked from behind the garage door, curious. Victoria noticed her immediately and smiled. She knelt slightly, so her eyes met the little girl's. I heard your dad doesn't stop working unless someone reminds him to eat, she said, holding out the bakery box. Warm cinnamon and fresh butter escaped as Lily carefully accepted it with both hands. Thank you, she whispered before disappearing inside to set it on the table. Victoria remained standing in the quiet garage, surrounded by shelves of neatly organized tools instead of polished corporate displays. The yellow work lights cast a warm glow across the concrete floor while the Porsche rested silently outside, no longer the center of attention. Ethan leaned against the fender of the pickup, the folded shop towel still in his hands. You didn't have to drive all the way here. Victoria glanced around the modest garage. Every wrench hung in its place. Every shelf was clean. Every repaired vehicle waited for its owner. Nothing looked expensive, yet everything looked cared for. I wasn't coming because of the Porsche, she said. I came because I didn't want my last words to you to be spoken in a showroom. Ethan listened without interrupting. She drew one slow breath and looked directly at him. Today I apologized because I judged your work. She paused as the evening breeze stirred a loose strand of hair across her face. Tonight I'm apologizing because I judged the man. Ethan looked toward the open garage, where Lily laughed while arranging the cinnamon rolls onto small plates. The simple sound filled the space more completely than the applause from any corporate event ever could. He turned back toward Victoria with the same calm expression he had worn all day. Then your apology has already done its job. Victoria smiled, not with triumph, but with relief. For the first time since morning, there was nothing left to prove between them except what they might choose to build next. Siwe. The garage door remained open as the last glow of evening settled across the gravel lot, bathing Ethan's old pickup and Victoria's perfectly restored Porsche in the same soft amber light. Inside, the warm aroma of cinnamon rolls mingled with tomato soup, while the old radio hummed quietly beneath Lily's laughter. She carried 3 plates to the small wooden table with careful hands, pausing only long enough to look from her father to Victoria with the simple curiosity only a child could have. "Dad," she asked, "is our guest staying for dinner?" Ethan smiled before answering, "If she still wants to." Victoria looked around the modest garage one more time. The walls held neatly arranged wrenches instead of awards. A faded calendar hung beside shelves of carefully labeled parts. Every surface reflected care rather than wealth. She slipped off her jacket, folded it over the back of a chair, and took a seat without waiting for anyone to serve her. The polished boardrooms where she usually made billion-dollar decisions suddenly felt very far away. Ethan filled 3 bowls with soup, setting one in front of Victoria before taking his own seat. Steam curled gently into the warm light, carrying the scent of herbs and roasted tomatoes across the table. Nobody hurried to speak. The quiet felt comfortable instead of awkward. Lily reached for a cinnamon roll, tore it neatly in half, and placed the larger piece onto Victoria's plate with a shy smile. "Dad says guests get the biggest one." Victoria looked at Ethan. He answered only with the smallest shrug. "House rule." She laughed softly, the sound lighter than it had been all day. After dinner, she stepped outside with Ethan while Lily washed the dishes, humming to herself through the open garage door. The Porsche stood beside the pickup beneath the first evening stars, its flawless paint reflecting both vehicles equally beneath the porch light. Victoria rested one hand lightly on the roof of the car that had brought them together. "This morning," she said, "I made a joke in front of everyone." Ethan leaned casually against his truck, the cool metal pressing against his shoulder. "You did." She looked directly into his eyes. "I said if you fixed my Porsche, I'd marry you." She let the words settle naturally into the quiet night before continuing. "Back then they were only meant to embarrass you." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Now," he asked gently. Victoria smiled, not with confidence, but with honesty. "Now I know a promise like that can't begin with a challenge. It has to begin with respect." She took one slow step closer. "I'm not asking you to marry me because you repaired my car. I'm asking whether you'd allow me the chance to earn a place in your life." Ethan looked through the open garage where Lily was drying dishes with exaggerated concentration, humming happily beneath the warm kitchen light. He looked back at Victoria, then slowly offered his hand. She accepted it without hesitation. "We'll take this one dinner at a time," he said. "One conversation at a time. One ordinary day at a time." Victoria nodded, her fingers tightening gently around his. "That sounds better than any joke I ever made." The Porsche had been repaired hours earlier, but the greatest thing Ethan restored that day was never hidden beneath its hood. It was the quiet truth that respect is the only road strong enough to carry love all the way home.